Hello, welcome. I'm Holly Hankinson, Advocacy Director of the Women's Fund of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. Welcome to our Appointed 101 training. Appointed is an initiative to increase the number of women on civic boards and commissions in our region. Once a year, we do an annual training to learn more about board service and give you the tools you need to confidently lead. So in this part of our board training, we are going to talk about board basics. So we're going to talk about what civic boards are, what are the different types of boards, and what it's like to apply and serve. If you don't really know what a board is, don't worry, you are not alone. That is what we're here for today. So what is a civic board? So civic boards are public bodies where members are appointed by a government official. So usually this government official is someone who's elected. Sometimes they're not, but it's always a government official that does the appointment. It's not a nonprofit or corporate board, and members are kind of what we call super volunteers. They're volunteering their time and talents, and they're also doing a public service because they're serving their community. So like I mentioned, these are not nonprofit or corporate boards. They're a little bit different. And so we're going to go through some of the ways that civic boards are different from nonprofit and corporate boards that we're all sort of more accustomed to dealing with and hearing about. One other note before I talk about these differences is that you'll often hear boards talked about as boards or commissions. Sometimes you'll hear committees and task forces. The name doesn't really matter. There's a little bit of a difference between committees and task force. Usually a committee can be made up of elected officials, sort of part of an actual elected body. A task force is usually a specific period of time or a specific issue focus, but a lot of times these words are used interchangeably. All right, so here we go. So the selection for civic boards, like I mentioned, is government appointment. As you can see in nonprofit and corporate boards, there are other ways that they select their members. Sometimes it's in the bylaws for a nonprofit or board, or they're elected by their shareholders as in the corporate boards. In civic boards, you're accountable to the public. That is a really big difference between these other bodies. You don't have any allegiance to a specific organization or shareholders. It's really the public that you're serving. Some other stakeholders in civic boards, community groups, there's interested parties depending on what the board subject matter is, and elected officials. Money matters. So for money, in corporate boards, it's all about the profits and the share price. Nonprofit boards, they think about their donors and their grants and where their money's coming from. For civic boards, the funding is really government funds and taxes really drive the work of these boards. The powers are a little bit different as well. So for nonprofit boards, a lot of times the board sets the strategic direction, hires an executive director, thinks about fundraising. For corporate boards, they hire the CEO, they protect the assets, they make some big sort of management decisions. For civic boards, it really depends on the board itself. And we'll talk a little bit about some boards and what they do a little bit later, but there's not a clear power. It just really depends on the board. Transparency is a big difference between civic boards and others. It's required in all public bodies, and we'll talk about that in the second part of our board basics, our legal basics. We talk about transparency and what those requirements are. And then finally, geography. There's some geographical differences. For geography, civic boards are generally, they govern a specific geographical area. So it might be a county or a town, or maybe it's a few counties or a state, but they have a really specific geographical area that they focus on. For nonprofit and corporate boards, that's usually not the key defining geography of their organization. So for nonprofit boards, a lot of times there's a service area that they serve, and for corporate boards, it's wherever their customers are or wherever their plants are located. So that just talks about some of the differences of some of these different boards. And now we're going to move and talk about some of the categories. So there are a lot of different things that these boards do. I mentioned earlier that there are, different sort of powers of the board. Well, you can see by this list of the different categories that there are a lot of different things that they cover. So we've bucketed our regional boards into these sort of 6 areas. Other places bucket them a little bit differently when they think about the boards. So we have a categories of arts and humanities. So these boards are the Parks and Recs boards, some arts organizations, boards that deal with children or youth, gender equity boards sort of fall into this bucket. Next, we have the economic development and sort of tax and finance boards. So a lot of these are boards that deal with taxes, how are the taxes used, what taxes are raised, a lot of finance boards, and there's a lot of power in some of these boards as well. So economic development boards are boards where they're really deciding what whole communities are going to be doing and where how they're going to improve jobs in the community. Um, Pensions fall in this category as well, tourism, those sorts of things. Health and Human Services boards are a lot of the boards that deal with human services and social services that we think of the government providing to a lot of people. So mental health, social services, elder care, sort of boards that help individuals in their lives. There are a lot of land use boards that is something that actually you might be most familiar with is when you think about civic boards. So boards that are like zoning boards, planning boards, historical preservation boards. So these are boards that deal with sort of how property and zoning and communities are developed. Environmental boards also fall into this category. So things like water runoff and where environmental considerations are in play a lot. So there aren't a lot of transportation boards, but these boards are often incredibly important and incredibly powerful. So these are boards that run the bus systems in the region, airports, public transportation, all those sort of big transportation systems are often governed by public boards. And finally, there's a whole category of boards that we kind of define as other. It's a catch-all for boards that are sort of smaller government functions, so water and sewer districts, some functions like the fire departments and police departments sometimes have oversight bodies, elections, animal management. There's other boards that sort of serve other government functions that fall into that category. And so there's been some work done on where women are represented on these boards by category. And so in Santa Barbara County was a place that we have looked to that has done some research on the gender breakdown on their appointed boards. In there, what they found, and we've looked in our region as well, and it tracks, is that women are disproportionately represented in some of these arts and humanities boards and health and human services boards. So the ones that sort of deal with people and culture, and they're less represented in the land use and the economic development bodies as well. So they saw this in Santa Barbara. We've seen that here. And actually in Cincinnati, women are least represented in the transportation and land use boards. So just something to think about as we think about gender equity. We want women on boards, equitably represented on boards across the region. And we really want to make sure that women of color in particular are represented on boards where real important community-wide decisions are being made. So locally, these are just a few examples of some of these boards in these categories. So like I mentioned, the Zoning Commission under land use, there's workforce investment boards, human services advisory committees on health and human services. There's just a few examples of boards here. So we've talked a little bit about the types of boards and their categories and their subject matter. There are also boards are broken down a little bit by what they function, what their function is, and how they are, what their operations are. Excuse me. So first, we have boards that are sort of direct authority boards and have direct oversight. So these are boards that have oversight over a public agency or department. So they have independent oversight, they manage the budget, they set the policy direction, they hire the CEO or executive director of this organization, that sort of thing. So these boards really operate more like corporations. So a few examples of these are Mental Health and Recovery Services Board. There are several of those in our region. SORTA, which manages the entire transportation system. So they manage metro bus system as an entire unit. The Parks Board is that way. The Board of Health, they have their own independent budgets and they manage the direction for the organization. The second type of board is a regulatory board. So these boards are often part of the administrative process of the government. So they enforce existing laws and regulations. And a lot of times these are very formal boards. Sometimes the hearings can be long, and they can be a little bit like a courtroom where parties come in, they have attorneys to help them, and they're really part of the internal working of the government. So these are boards like the zoning board, the planning commission. There are a lot of appeals boards that are like this. So there's a zoning appellate board where if an individual doesn't like the decision that a zoning board would make, they could appeal it to the next level up in the government. So these are a lot of regulatory boards. So if you're interested in sort of a lot of details and applying rules, this could be a good board for you. The third type are advisory boards. So a lot of these boards focus on making policy recommendations or advising an elected body or an agency on what they should be doing about a certain thing. So some of these boards can be higher profile than others. Some of them are not. It just depends on what they do, but they really are making recommendations for what government should be doing in a certain area. So some examples of this are the Human Services Advisory Committee in the city of Cincinnati. This board makes recommendations to city council of what the city should be doing with its human services funding. Elderly Services Advisory Commission, is it similar? They make recommendations about elderly services to actually in Warren County. And the Commission on Women and Girls in Hamilton County is another example. They make recommendations to the county commissioners about different policy recommendations and actions that they should be taking. And so finally, there are a number of boards that are sort of nonprofit or independent boards, so bodies. So governments sometimes make appointments to these boards. So I know we talked before about nonprofits and how I said that, public civic boards are different than that. I'm kind of going back on that now, but it's just because sometimes the government will have a seat on a community-based organization where they have an interest. So locally, some that can be the zoo, Findlay Market, the Cincinnati Arts Association. So there's a few places like that have government seats. And sometimes these are quasi-government agencies themselves. So there are a few regional government bodies that a lot of governments have board seats too, and they're sort of independent organizations in themselves. One second. Apologies, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Okay. So where does your board fit? I know that can be, it can be a lot to think about what board would be right for you. So we've thought about, what people's different comfort levels might be on where they would want to serve on a board. So there are certain boards that have more direct control or authority over their sort of agency of what they're doing, and the indirect control. So we're looking at which ones have direct control and indirect control. Some boards have a higher visibility and some boards have lower visibility. So that's sort of how we broke it down. So let's give you a few examples. So the Board of Developmental Disabilities is a good example. So that board has a lot of direct control. They manage a budget and they control an entire agency. It's not exactly a really high visibility board in the community. Here's another one that has, somewhat direct control, the Flood Damage Renovation Variance Board. So this is a very specific board. They have a lot of direct control. They get to make determinations and variances on this issue, but they have pretty low visibility. I don't think a lot of people are, beating down the door of the Flood Damage Renovation Variance Board to go to their meetings and see what they're doing. Another board that doesn't have direct control because it's more of an advisory board, but has a lot of visibility, is the Tax Levy Review Committee. So this committee makes recommendations on what tax levies should go on the ballot. So a lot of people care about that. Obviously, it's things that impact the whole community. These are levies that go on the ballot in Hamilton County in particular. They don't make the decision themselves, but they make the recommendation to the county commissioners, but they have a lot of visibility. And finally, there's the tree board. A lot of communities have boards around their tree maintenance in public ways. And this is a board that has not a ton of direct control and not a lot of visibility as well, unless you are in that community and the tree is probably in front of your house. So this board is a little bit lower visibility. And finally, one of those regional transportation boards we talked about earlier, SORTA. So this board manages the Southwest Ohio Regional Transportation System. This board has a lot of control over the transportation system and also a lot of visibility as well. So you're thinking about a board. I know we've had, again, a lot of information. We spoke with one of our board members a few years ago as we were launching this and got some really good advice for how to approach it. So she said, time, talent, and passion are key. Make sure that the work of the board is a mountain you're willing to die on. Find a board that fits your talents and passions and join at the right time in your life. If you're young and busy, pick something that's close to home or your work, and don't forget to put yourself first. Don't join to build your resume. Come prepared to meetings, ask questions. Don't lose your own voice, own your own words. I thought that was great advice and very relevant. It has to fit into your life. It has to be something that you care about and something that you can fit into your life. Okay, so getting started. So the application process for boards is usually involves some sort of application or resume and a statement of interest. So different communities do this a little bit differently, but those are the basic elements of what you have to provide. There's often an interview process as well. And one thing that that is really different about these boards and what's nice sometimes is you actually don't have to usually make a financial obligation to serve on this board. I know sometimes nonprofit boards, there's an expectation to donate. For public boards, there's not an expectation. These are all public boards. So what are some things to consider once you serve on a board? So some other things we haven't talked about is, what are meetings like? Are they formal? Are they really formal meetings? Are they structured, highly structured, or are they looser and sort of more discussion focused? Are the boards, do they meet once a month on a regular schedule, or are they more sort of a task force where they might meet a lot for a month or so and then they don't meet again? Think about the board roles. Are there, president or board chairs and vice chairs and committees, or is it sort of a sort of looser structure of a board? It's also important to think about whether there's going to be a board orientation. That can be really helpful. And the service length. So some boards you're appointed for a year or two. Some boards are 4 or 5 years long. So how long are you willing to make this commitment for? Those are all important things to think about. All right, so that is it for board basics, a part of our Appointed 101. We would encourage you to visit our website if you want to learn more or connect with us with any questions. And thank you very much for joining us.